The beginnings of mummification. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the warm, dry sands of ancient Egypt, where the afterlife was just as important as life itself. Picture this, a land where the sun blazes down on golden tombs, and endless pyramids rise like ancient giants. You might not survive this journey, after all, they took their preservation very seriously. But before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your location and local time in the comments below, I love hearing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Mummification. If you've ever watched a documentary or caught a glimpse of a mummy in a museum, you know it's not your average burial practice. Egyptians weren't just burying their dead, they were preparing them for the afterlife, a continuation of life, as they believed, just on another plane. But to get there, your body had to stay intact. Preservation, you see, was essential. Now, let's talk about the origins of this practice. The Egyptians weren't always so meticulous with their dead. In the early years, bodies were just buried in shallow graves or left out in the desert. But over time, something extraordinary happened. They began to notice how the dry, hot sands mummified bodies naturally. This led to a deeper understanding of how to preserve the body, and from this moment, mummification started evolving into an intricate, sacred art. And just like that, the Egyptians were onto something. They were now preparing their deceased for a journey they thought would never end. Historians still argue whether the process of mummification began as a result of religious necessity or simply out of curiosity about the body's preservation. The idea of an afterlife was central to Egyptian religion, with the gods playing an essential role in ensuring one's soul could transition smoothly into this otherworldly existence. But whether it was divine inspiration or just the natural processes that led them to this point, mummification became both an art and a deeply religious rite. Gods, afterlife, and the need for preservation. As we venture deeper into the mystery of Egyptian mummification, we must turn our gaze toward the gods. The Egyptians didn't just view death as the end, to them, it was merely a transition, a change of state. And for this transition, they needed more than just a preserved body, they needed divine intervention. You see, the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife. It wasn't just a belief, it was their reality. In fact, everything they did during their lifetime was in preparation for this journey. Now, let's imagine the grandeur of it all. The afterlife wasn't some dreary place, it was a paradise, think lush fields, bright skies, and eternal peace. But to get there, you had to be properly equipped. Your soul, which was thought to consist of multiple parts, had to journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, to reach the field of reeds, where you would be granted eternal life. This is where mummification came into play. Without a well-preserved body, the soul couldn't recognize its host, and the body would be left to decay, unable to provide the necessary support for the soul's journey. The gods were everything in this process. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, death, and resurrection, played a central role. His myth was the foundation of Egyptian beliefs about death and resurrection. Osiris was once the king of Egypt, but after being killed by his brother Set, he was resurrected by his wife, Isis. This story wasn't just a myth, it was seen as the blueprint for the afterlife. As the ruler of the afterlife, Osiris was the one who would welcome the dead into their eternal rest, and to reach him, the deceased needed to be perfectly preserved. Historians still debate whether the ancient Egyptians truly understood the concept of immortality in the same way we do today. While they believed in the continuity of the soul, they might not have seen it as eternal in a modern sense. Instead, it was about the soul's ability to return to the body, to inhabit it once more in the afterlife. The preservation of the body was, therefore, crucial. It wasn't just about keeping the body intact, it was about making sure the soul could find its way back home. The role of embalmers. Now, let's take a closer look at the people who were tasked with this sacred duty, embalmers. These weren't your average morticians, they were specialists in preserving the body and safeguarding the deceased for the afterlife. The embalming process was so revered that it became a closely guarded secret, passed down through generations. Only a select few knew the intricate rituals involved, and they often belonged to specialized families whose role it was to prepare the dead for their journey. Imagine, for a moment, the embalmer's workshop. It was a solemn place filled with the scent of myrrh and resins. The embalmers worked in dimly lit rooms, where they handled the deceased with the utmost care and reverence. Some of the embalming techniques were so sacred that the workers had to purify themselves before beginning their craft, ensuring they didn't contaminate the body or the soul. It's said that the embalmers were almost as revered as the priests. After all, they were the ones who ensured that the deceased could find their way to the afterlife. But let's not sugarcoat it too much, embalmers weren't always seen as the most glamorous professionals. They had a very specific and somewhat grisly task, dealing with the remains of the deceased. While the embalming process was vital for the deceased, the workers who performed the mummification had to handle all sorts of unpleasant tasks, like removing the organs and ensuring the body was properly preserved. The embalmers didn't just remove the organs, they knew the exact process and timing necessary to keep the body intact. The organs, after all, had to be carefully preserved, but the process of doing so was anything but pretty. Historians still debate whether the embalmers had a deep spiritual connection to the work they did, or if they were simply performing a task like any other profession. It's hard to say. On one hand, there was no doubt that the embalmers played a crucial role in the Egyptian religion, but on the other hand, they may have simply seen it as a job that paid well and came with high status in society. Regardless, the skill and secrecy surrounding their craft contributed to the mysterious aura of mummification. The special tools and chemicals used. As we delve further into the world of Egyptian mummification, let's take a moment to appreciate the fascinating tools and chemicals that were essential in preserving the body. Now, we're talking about some serious ancient science here, tools and methods that were nothing short of groundbreaking at the time. You probably wouldn't be able to recognize half of the tools used by the embalmers, but in their hands, these tools performed the delicate dance of preserving life after death. First, let's talk about the most iconic chemical used in mummification, natron. Natron was a naturally occurring mixture of sodium bicarbonate, sodium carbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate, and it was the secret ingredient that allowed the Egyptians to dry out the body and prevent decay. Imagine the embalmers carefully packing the body in this mixture, all the while chanting incantations and performing ritualistic steps to ensure that the soul's journey to the afterlife would not be interrupted by a decomposing body. Natron acted as a desiccant, essentially sucking out the moisture from the body, which prevented it from decaying. Without this key element, mummification wouldn't have been nearly as effective. But that's not all. The embalmers didn't just use natron. They also relied heavily on resins and oils, substances that had both preservative and symbolic meanings. They would anoint the body with fragrant oils and resins to give it a divine aroma, which was believed to protect the deceased from evil spirits in the afterlife. These oils were often derived from plants and trees like cedar, frankincense, and myrrh, all of which were considered sacred by the Egyptians. Can you imagine the smell of these oils filling the embalming room, mixing with the natural scents of myrrh and balsam? It was as much a sensory experience as a ritualistic one. Historians still argue about the specific origins of some of the embalming chemicals. While natron was readily available in ancient Egypt, some scholars believe that the Egyptians may have discovered the use of certain resins and oils through trade with other cultures. Did they truly understand the science behind what they were doing, or was it a series of trial and error that led them to these magical substances? Perhaps a little bit of both. One thing's for sure, the ancient Egyptians were masters of preserving life, even after death. The intricate process of evisceration. Now, let's dive into one of the more intense parts of the mummification process, the removal of the internal organs, or what we call evisceration. Trust me, this part wasn't for the faint of heart. While the rest of the mummification process may have involved rituals and gentle anointing, this was where the embalmers got a little more hands-on, and, let's just say, a little more grisly. Before the body could be perfectly preserved, it had to be emptied. And by empty, I mean all of the internal organs had to be carefully removed. The reason behind this? Simple, the organs are where the majority of the body's moisture resides, and moisture is the enemy of mummification. The organs also contain bacteria that could speed up decomposition, which is something the embalmers were keen to avoid. So, out they came, every last one, except the heart. The heart, as you can imagine, held a very special place in the Egyptian belief system. First, the embalmers would make an incision along the side of the body, carefully cutting away the skin and tissue. With great care, they would remove the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver, each one carefully preserved for the afterlife. The lungs and stomach were often placed in special canopic jars, while the liver and intestines were sometimes dried separately or wrapped in linen. The intestines and other organs were often treated with oils and resins to preserve them. The process was so intricate that the embalmers took time to preserve even the smallest of the internal structures. Historians still debate the mystery of the brain's removal. Did the Egyptians know about the brain's function? It was often discarded during the mummification process, with little care given to its preservation. The brain wasn't typically stored in a canopic jar like the other organs. Instead, it was either removed through the nose using a hook or simply discarded as waste. But here's the thing, did they understand that the brain controlled the body's functions? Or was it that they considered it insignificant in the grand scheme of the afterlife? No one knows for sure. What we do know is that the heart was considered the most vital organ, not the brain, and it was the only organ left in place. The heart would be weighed in the afterlife during the famous weighing of the heart ceremony to determine whether the soul was worthy of entering the field of reeds. So, while this part of the process might sound a little gruesome to our modern ears, it was absolutely necessary to preserve the body for the journey ahead. The embalming wasn't just about keeping the body intact, it was about ensuring the soul could find its way back. The use of amulets and spells. At this point in the mummification process, the body is essentially prepared for the afterlife, preserved, empty of its organs, and wrapped in linen. But the journey wasn't quite over yet. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul needed more than just a preserved body to ensure a smooth passage into the afterlife. It needed protection, guidance, and most importantly, power. Enter the amulets and spells. During mummification, a host of amulets, small, symbolic objects, were placed throughout the body or wrapped within the linen bandages. Each of these amulets had a specific purpose. Some were meant to protect the deceased from harmful spirits, while others were designed to offer strength and support during the trials of the afterlife. The amulets came in various shapes and sizes, often fashioned from materials like stone, wood, or even gold. Among the most common was the Eye of Horus, a powerful symbol of protection and healing. The Eye of Horus wasn't just for the living, it was just as important for the dead, as it helped shield the deceased from evil forces. But the amulets weren't just there for physical protection. Each one had a specific, magical purpose, believed to be capable of guiding the soul through the dangers of the Duat, the underworld. Some amulets were intended to ensure the safe journey of the soul, while others were meant to aid the soul in passing the judgment of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Historians still argue whether the amulets were solely for the protection of the deceased or if they had a deeper symbolic meaning tied to the Egyptian religious belief system. The Egyptians didn't just see the amulets as magical objects, they saw them as necessary tools for the soul's journey. By placing them inside the body or around it, the embalmers were ensuring that the deceased had everything they needed for the journey ahead. But there's more. Along with the amulets, spells were also recited during the mummification process. These weren't just random incantations, they were carefully crafted magical formulas that were believed to give the deceased the power to navigate the afterlife. The spells were inscribed on tomb walls or written on papyrus, and they were often tailored to the specific needs of the individual. These spells were designed to protect the soul, give it strength, and ensure that it would be able to overcome any obstacles in the afterlife. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and prayers, was often buried with the deceased to assist them in their journey. Historians still debate the extent to which the Egyptians believed in the literal power of these spells. Were they merely symbolic, or did the Egyptians genuinely believe they could influence the soul's fate in the afterlife? The fact that these spells were so carefully preserved, etched onto walls, written on papyrus, and spoken during rituals, suggests that they held a great deal of importance in Egyptian society. Perhaps, like the amulets, these spells were seen as essential tools for ensuring a safe and smooth journey to eternity. How mummies were stored for eternity. By now, the body has been carefully preserved, wrapped in linen, adorned with protective amulets, and safeguarded with powerful spells. But that's not the end of the story. Once mummification was complete, the next step was placing the body in a tomb that would protect it for all eternity. This final phase in the journey was no less significant than the rituals of embalming. The tomb wasn't just a place to store the body, it was an elaborate, sacred space designed to ensure the deceased's immortality. Picture a tomb deep in the desert, hidden away from the eyes of grave robbers and desecrators. The tomb was a physical barrier, designed to shield the mummy from the harsh elements and the potential harm of both human and supernatural forces. But beyond the physical protection, the tomb was also seen as a magical space, a place where the deceased could be surrounded by the tools and offerings they would need in the afterlife. The tomb's interior was typically filled with all sorts of objects meant to sustain the soul on its journey. You might find statues of gods and goddesses, precious jewels, food, furniture, and even chariots. Some tombs were so grand that they resembled miniature versions of the deceased's earthly home, complete with servants and other representations of daily life. For the Egyptians, the tomb was not just a place to rest, it was a reflection of the life the deceased had lived and their hopes for an eternity filled with peace and prosperity. One of the most fascinating aspects of these tombs was their construction. The tombs were often carved into the rock or built from stone, designed to be both awe-inspiring and functional. Inside, walls were adorned with hieroglyphics and murals depicting scenes of the afterlife. These images served as a map for the soul, showing the deceased what to expect during their journey and offering guidance on how to navigate the underworld. Historians still argue over how much of the tomb's design was based on the belief in an afterlife versus practical needs. Was the elaborate decoration meant to assist the soul in the afterlife, or was it simply a way to showcase the deceased's wealth and status? While the answer may never be entirely clear, what's undeniable is that the tomb played a crucial role in the Egyptians' complex understanding of death and the afterlife. But, of course, the most famous tombs are those of the pharaohs, like King Tutankhamun. The pharaohs were believed to be divine rulers, and their tombs were built to reflect their unique status. They were often filled with unimaginable wealth, golden masks, jewelry, and treasures meant to accompany the pharaoh into the afterlife. These grand tombs served not only as resting places but as monuments to the power and influence the pharaoh had while living. Yet even these tombs, as grand as they were, couldn't fully protect the mummies from the forces of time and human greed. Many of Egypt's tombs were raided by grave robbers over the centuries, their treasures looted, and their contents scattered. Even today, the tombs and their mummies continue to fascinate people around the world. The preservation of the pharaohs. As we focus on the mummification of pharaohs, it's clear that these royal figures received the most elaborate and intricate treatment in the afterlife preparation process. Pharaohs were seen not only as rulers of Egypt but as gods themselves, and their mummification was meant to reflect their divine status. The preservation of the body was not just an act of practicality, it was a profound expression of their eternal reign. But what makes the mummification of pharaohs so fascinating is the sheer scale and complexity involved. When a pharaoh died, it wasn't just his body that needed to be preserved, it was his power, his spirit, and his divine essence. The embalming process for pharaohs was more elaborate than any other mummification. It involved multiple embalmers, priests, and even artists, who worked together to ensure that the king's body was perfectly prepared for the afterlife. In fact, the process could take up to 70 days, far longer than the mummification of ordinary Egyptians. The most notable example is that of King Tutankhamun. His tomb, when discovered in 1922 by archaeologist Howard Carter, was filled with treasures beyond belief, golden masks, chariots, weapons, and much more. But what made his mummification particularly interesting was how much it revealed about the embalming process. Tutankhamun's body had been carefully preserved, but his mummification was less elaborate than that of other pharaohs. This led some to believe that he may have been a very young pharaoh who hadn't fully completed the rituals of his embalming. Nonetheless, the sheer wealth and complexity of his burial reflected the grandeur of his reign. Historians still argue over the symbolism behind the mummification of pharaohs. Some scholars believe that the extravagant embalming process was not just about preserving the body, it was a way to ensure the pharaoh's continued rule in the afterlife. Pharaohs were thought to be the intermediaries between the gods and the people, so their bodies needed to be preserved in the most sacred and powerful way possible to ensure that they could continue to rule Egypt from the realm of the dead. But it wasn't just about the physical preservation of the body. The tombs of pharaohs were designed to reflect their divine status, and the objects they were buried with were meant to ensure that they had everything they needed for their journey into the afterlife. These objects ranged from everyday items, like clothing and furniture, to items of great symbolic value, like statues of gods, magical amulets, and even entire rooms filled with food and drink. All of this was meant to ensure that the pharaoh had everything he needed to continue his eternal reign, not just as a ruler of Egypt but as a god who would live forever. The preservation of the pharaohs was a monumental task, one that involved the highest levels of craftsmanship, spirituality, and statecraft. Their tombs were not just places of burial, they were places of divine transformation, where the king's earthly body was prepared to enter the eternal world of the gods. The elaborate rituals, the vast treasure troves, and the incredible care with which they were preserved all spoke to the Egyptians' belief in the power of the pharaohs and their divine connection to the gods. The mystery of the cursed mummy. Now that we've explored the extraordinary lengths the ancient Egyptians went to preserve their mummies, let's dive into one of the most fascinating, and chilling, legends surrounding mummification, the curse of the mummy. You've probably heard of it, the mysterious, often deadly curse said to befall those who disturb the resting places of the ancient dead. The idea of a mummy's curse gained widespread attention after the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, but the notion of cursed tombs and vengeful spirits predates even that famous discovery. The idea that mummies, particularly those of pharaohs, were cursed to exact revenge on anyone who dared disturb their tombs was popularized by a series of eerie events surrounding King Tut's tomb. After the tomb was opened, several members of the expedition team, including Lord Carnarvon, the man who financed the excavation, died under mysterious circumstances. Lord Carnarvon died shortly after the tomb was opened, reportedly from an infected mosquito bite that led to blood poisoning. His death, followed by a string of other untimely deaths of those involved in the discovery, sparked the imagination of the public. Newspapers eagerly seized on the idea of a deadly curse, and it was. Historians still argue whether there is any truth to the curse of the mummy, or if it's just a product of superstition and sensationalism. Some believe that the deaths of those involved in the discovery of King Tut's tomb were merely coincidental, while others argue that the idea of a curse was intentionally created to add a mystical element to the archaeological discovery. After all, a curse is a far more thrilling story than a simple infection, right? But even before King Tut's tomb, mummies were surrounded by rumors of curses. Ancient Egyptians believed that the tombs of their pharaohs were sacred spaces, and disturbing them was not only disrespectful to the deceased but could also invite disaster. It's possible that the idea of a curse was tied to the belief that the soul of the deceased would remain in the tomb, guarding it from outsiders. The curse, in this sense, may have been seen as a form of spiritual protection. However, the curse of the mummy has also been debunked by skeptics. Modern historians and scientists argue that many of the supposed mummy curse deaths can be explained by natural causes, such as bacteria, mold, and even simple infection from opening tombs that have been sealed for centuries. In fact, tombs in Egypt are often filled with harmful bacteria and spores that could easily make someone ill if exposed to them. Still, despite the logical explanations, the legend of the mummy's curse persists in popular culture, feeding into our fascination with the mysterious world of ancient Egypt. In the end, the curse may be a perfect storm of superstition, coincidence, and storytelling. Whether you believe in it or not, there's no denying that it adds an extra layer of intrigue to the already mystifying world of Egyptian mummies. So, the next time you visit a museum or watch a movie featuring an ancient tomb, just remember, you might be closer to a curse than you think. The role of crocodile dung in mummification. Let's move on to something a little more unexpected, and, dare I say, a little more quirky, when it comes to the mummification process: crocodile dung. Yes, you heard that right. The ancient Egyptians, in their wisdom and resourcefulness, used crocodile dung in a variety of ways, and believe it or not, it played a role in the mummification process. It sounds bizarre, doesn't it? But there's a method to the madness. Now, before you start imagining embalmers slathering mummies with piles of crocodile dung, let's take a step back. Crocodile dung, which was naturally abundant along the Nile River, was considered to have a number of useful properties. It was believed to have antibacterial qualities, which made it useful in preserving the body. When it came to mummification, the Egyptians were meticulous in their methods, using everything at their disposal to preserve both the physical body and the spiritual essence of the deceased. Crocodile dung was used to help preserve the skin and to prevent decomposition in the early stages of mummification. But crocodile dung wasn't just for the physical body. It was also believed to have magical properties. In Egyptian mythology, crocodiles were sacred creatures, often associated with the god Sobek, the god of fertility, strength, and protection. By incorporating crocodile dung into the embalming process, the Egyptians may have believed they were invoking Sobek's protection for the deceased as they journeyed into the afterlife. Historians still debate whether the use of crocodile dung was truly effective in preserving mummies, or whether it was simply a symbolic gesture. Some argue that the dung might have helped to mask the smell of decay or may have been used as part of a ritualistic cleansing process. Others believe it could have had actual preservative properties due to its natural compounds. Whatever the reason, the use of crocodile dung highlights the Egyptians' creative and resourceful approach to mummification. And here's the kicker: crocodile dung wasn't just used in mummification. It was also applied as a sunscreen by ancient Egyptians. Yes, in the hot Egyptian sun, it was believed that the dung could protect the skin from the harsh rays, keeping both the embalmers and the deceased from being scorched by the relentless desert sun. It's fascinating to think that something so seemingly odd was used in both preservation and protection. Historians still argue about how widespread the use of crocodile dung actually was. Was it a common ingredient, or was it reserved for the elite, like the pharaohs and high priests? It's difficult to say, but the fact that it was used in both everyday life and the sacred practices of mummification speaks to the Egyptians' deep understanding of both the practical and the mystical aspects of life and death. The debate over the brain's removal. By now, you're probably starting to get a feel for how deeply involved the ancient Egyptians were in their mummification process. They were methodical, precise, and, let's face it, quite a bit peculiar in some of their practices. And when it came to mummification, no organ was left untouched, well, except for one. The brain. The removal of the brain during mummification remains one of the more curious and debated aspects of Egyptian embalming. Why, you might ask, would they go through all that trouble to preserve the body, but then casually toss out something as important as the brain? Was it ignorance? Or something more profound? Let's start with what we know. During the mummification process, embalmers would remove the internal organs, but the brain was almost always discarded. The brain wasn't removed the same way the organs were. There was no neat incision and storage in a canopic jar. Instead, the brain was either removed through the nose with a long hook or simply liquefied and drained out. It was often tossed aside without ceremony, left behind to decay. Now, that raises the question: did the Egyptians understand the function of the brain? Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians knew the brain's true role in controlling thought, memory, and movement. Some believe that the Egyptians saw the heart as the seat of intellect, emotion, and the soul, and that the brain was simply seen as an unimportant organ. It might have been discarded because it was considered unnecessary for the afterlife, where the heart would play a far more significant role. But here's the twist: some evidence suggests that the Egyptians may have actually known about the brain's function, but chose to disregard it. While they were certainly skilled anatomists and had an understanding of how the body worked, their religious beliefs could have led them to prioritize the heart over the brain. The heart was seen as the core of the person's being, the very essence of the soul. Meanwhile, the brain was viewed as something more mundane, perhaps associated with physical processes that were less important in the afterlife. On the other hand, there's a theory that the brain wasn't completely irrelevant in Egyptian thinking. Some argue that the Egyptians understood the brain's role, but chose to focus on the heart because of its symbolic importance in religious rituals. In fact, the heart was thought to be weighed against a feather in the afterlife during the weighing of the heart ceremony, a judgment that determined whether the deceased could enter the field of reeds, essentially, their version of paradise. So, if the heart was the center of the soul, the brain might simply have been seen as something too earthly, something unnecessary for the divine journey ahead. Historians still debate whether the Egyptians actually had a clear understanding of the brain's role in the body's function or whether it was completely overlooked in favor of the heart. It's an enduring mystery that continues to puzzle scholars today. The fact that the brain was often discarded so casually in the mummification process suggests that the Egyptians may have viewed it as unimportant, yet it also suggests that they had a deeper understanding of life and death than we might assume. Perhaps in their religious world, the brain simply wasn't needed. The mummy's impact on modern medicine. While the ancient Egyptians were clearly concerned with preserving bodies for the afterlife, their work also had profound effects on the world of modern medicine. You might not think of mummies as anything more than ancient curiosities, but the study of mummification has helped historians, archaeologists, and even doctors make major breakthroughs in understanding human anatomy, diseases, and medical practices. The more we learn about how the Egyptians preserved their dead, the more we realize how their techniques contributed to the foundation of modern medical knowledge. Let's start with the obvious: mummies are some of the best preserved bodies in the world. Unlike other ancient remains, mummies provide an extraordinary glimpse into how ancient people looked, what diseases they suffered from, and how they treated various ailments. Thanks to the meticulous embalming process, many mummies have been preserved for thousands of years, allowing scientists to study them in ways that would be impossible with other types of ancient remains. One of the most significant contributions of mummification to modern medicine was the way it helped early researchers understand the human body. In the past, many medical practices were based on guesswork, but mummies provided a real-life look at human anatomy. When early anatomists examined mummies, they discovered important details about muscles, bones, and internal organs. This knowledge, combined with autopsies and dissections of living humans, helped shape the development of anatomy as a medical field. In fact, many of the anatomical illustrations that we see today are based on findings from mummified remains. But the Egyptians didn't just preserve bodies for their anatomical value. The mummification process also gave early doctors insight into disease. Researchers have discovered evidence of a variety of illnesses in mummified remains, including tuberculosis, arthritis, and even cancer. By studying these ancient diseases, doctors have been able to track how certain conditions have evolved over time. For example, tuberculosis was once believed to be a disease of modern times, but mummified remains show that it existed in ancient Egypt as well. This has helped modern researchers understand how diseases spread and evolved throughout history. Historians and scientists still debate whether the Egyptians had an understanding of the diseases they were mummifying. Some scholars argue that the Egyptians had a remarkable level of medical knowledge for their time, while others believe that their medical practices were based on trial and error. Regardless of their understanding, it's clear that mummification and the study of ancient remains have had a profound impact on modern medicine. The preservation of bodies allowed for a wealth of medical information to be discovered, which would have been nearly impossible to obtain through other means. Perhaps most fascinating is the modern use of mummies in medical research. In the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers began to study mummies more systematically, using techniques like X-rays and CT scans to analyze the remains without damaging them. These advanced imaging techniques have allowed doctors to learn more about the health of ancient Egyptians and even uncover long-hidden mysteries about how they lived and died. For example, the use of CT scans on mummies has allowed researchers to identify surgical procedures such as brain surgery, which indicates that the ancient Egyptians may have been performing rudimentary forms of surgery thousands of years ago. So, while the ancient Egyptians may have had otherworldly goals in mind when they practiced mummification, their methods have ultimately left an enduring legacy in modern medicine. Their attention to detail in preserving the human body has allowed us to uncover important medical insights, shaping the way we understand health and disease today. The mummies, it seems, are still teaching us lessons, just not in the way the ancient Egyptians intended. The use of resin and linen. As we continue unraveling the secrets of Egyptian mummification, let's focus on two key materials that were essential in the preservation of bodies: resin and linen. These seemingly simple items played crucial roles in ensuring that the body not only survived the embalming process but also remained intact for millennia. The use of resin and linen in mummification speaks volumes about the Egyptians' deep understanding of both the physical and spiritual aspects of preservation. Let's start with linen. Linen cloth was the ultimate tool in wrapping the deceased, ensuring that the body was securely enveloped and protected from the elements. It wasn't just about wrapping, it was about wrapping well. The embalmers would carefully layer the linen around the body, sometimes up to 20 layers deep, binding the body tightly. This extensive wrapping technique had practical and ritualistic significance. The tight layers of linen helped ensure that the body would stay intact during its journey to the afterlife. It also served as a way to protect the body from external threats like insects and bacteria, ensuring that the mummy stayed preserved. Historians still argue about the exact symbolism of the linen wraps. Some suggest that the linen wrap served as a symbolic gesture, helping to bind the body and protect the soul. Others believe the linen was purely practical, helping to hold everything in place as the body underwent the preservation process. The fact that linen was used so extensively, sometimes even covering the head and face, indicates that the Egyptians placed great importance on both the physical and metaphysical aspects of the burial process. But linen wasn't the only material used. Resin played an equally important role in the preservation process, helping to solidify the mummy and keep it from decaying. Resin was applied to the linen and the body itself, creating a thick, protective coating that hardened over time. This resin was often made from tree sap and other natural substances, which were known for their preservative properties. The resin would harden to form a protective seal, ensuring that no moisture could reach the body and trigger decomposition. What's fascinating is the sheer variety of resins used. Some mummies were treated with aromatic resins like frankincense and myrrh, which not only had practical preservative qualities but also spiritual significance. Frankincense and myrrh were considered sacred by the Egyptians and were often associated with the gods. By using these resins, the embalmers weren't just preserving the body, they were imbuing it with divine protection. The sweet, earthy fragrance of the resins also helped to mask the odor of decay, creating a more pleasant, even sacred, environment for the deceased. Historians still debate how exactly the Egyptians came to understand the power of resin. Did they discover it through trial and error, or was it passed down through generations of priests and embalmers who understood the chemical properties of tree sap? It's unclear. But what's evident is that resin was more than just a practical tool, it was a vital part of the mummification process, serving both physical and spiritual functions. The use of resin and linen highlights the Egyptians' unique approach to mummification. It wasn't enough to simply preserve the body, they needed to ensure that it was perfectly wrapped and sealed, ready for its journey into the afterlife. And with resin's ability to protect and preserve, and linen's ability to bind and secure, the mummies were able to withstand the test of time. The bodies wrapped in linen and treated with resin were not just corpses, they were sacred vessels, carefully prepared for the next chapter of their eternal journey. The preservation of commoners versus pharaohs. By now, we've looked at the elaborate mummification of Egypt's royalty, but what about the commoners? How did everyday people fare when it came to their eternal preservation? While the mummification of pharaohs involved lavish tombs, expensive treasures, and the finest materials, the mummification of commoners was far more modest. However, the process still held the same essential purpose, preserving the body for the afterlife. Let's take a deeper dive into how the methods of preservation differed, and what that says about ancient Egyptian society. Pharaohs, of course, were treated as divine beings, and their mummification reflected their status. Their tombs were filled with gold, jewelry, and statues meant to provide for them in the afterlife. Their bodies were embalmed with the finest resins, wrapped in layers of linen, and placed in elaborate coffins. The entire process could take weeks or even months, and it was accompanied by prayers, rituals, and offerings from priests. The grandeur of their mummification was intended to ensure that their souls would continue to rule in the afterlife, just as they had in life. In death, the pharaohs needed not only protection but also a level of luxury and comfort that mirrored their earthly reign. But for commoners, the process was far simpler. The mummification of an average Egyptian, while still an extraordinary process, was far less expensive and less elaborate. Commoners would often be buried in shallow graves, with fewer treasures or luxuries to accompany them. Their mummies weren't as finely treated as the pharaohs. The use of expensive resins, for example, might be substituted with simpler substances like bitumen, and the wrapping could be less intricate. While their bodies were still preserved, the focus for commoners was more on the essential elements of preservation rather than luxury or status. That's not to say commoners weren't given respect in death. While their mummification was less ornate, many still underwent the process of embalming and had their bodies preserved to some extent. But the care and attention they received were simply on a different level. In some cases, the embalming process for commoners might involve just basic evisceration, wrapping, and the application of natron to dry out the body. The materials used for the embalming process would often be more affordable, and the process itself might be quicker than the grand ritual of a pharaoh's mummification. Historians still debate the social implications of this disparity. Did the Egyptians truly believe that only the pharaohs needed the highest level of mummification, or was it simply a reflection of their societal hierarchy? Was the difference in mummification a sign of Egypt's deeply rooted class system, or was it a religious practice based on divine status? Some scholars argue that mummification for commoners still reflected the belief in an afterlife, albeit with a more practical approach. Others contend that the level of mummification was strictly a matter of social status, with pharaohs receiving the royal treatment and the common folk having to settle for less. What we can say with certainty is that the difference in mummification between royalty and commoners speaks volumes about Egyptian society. The rich were not only treated with greater material wealth in life but also in death. But even for the common people, the belief in the afterlife was so strong that they sought to preserve their bodies, to maintain some connection to the world of the gods. The decline and rediscovery of mummification. As we close in on the end of our journey through the world of Egyptian mummification, it's time to reflect on the eventual decline of this fascinating practice, and how it was rediscovered centuries later, fueling both academic interest and widespread myth. For over 3,000 years, mummification was a central part of Egyptian culture, a ritual that ensured the deceased's passage to the afterlife. But like all things, it eventually came to an end, and the art of mummification gradually faded into obscurity. The decline of mummification can be traced back to several key events, with one of the most significant being the rise of Christianity in Egypt during the 4th century AD. As Christianity spread through the region, the traditional Egyptian religious beliefs, including the belief in an afterlife that required the preservation of the body, began to fade. The Christian view of the afterlife, which didn't require physical preservation of the body, led to the abandonment of mummification practices. Tombs were no longer filled with elaborate treasures and mummies, they were replaced with simpler burials and Christian rites. The power of Egypt's ancient gods and the importance of the afterlife slowly diminished, and with it, the once glorious art of mummification. But even though mummification as a practice was largely abandoned, its rediscovery centuries later would spark a new wave of fascination. In the 19th century, Egypt became a focal point of European exploration and archaeology. Egyptologists, drawn by the allure of ancient mysteries, began to unearth tombs and mummies, bringing the long-forgotten world of mummification back to life. The discovery of the tomb of King Tutankhamun in 1922 by archaeologist Howard Carter was a watershed moment that captured the imagination of people around the world. The treasures and the mummy of the young pharaoh, still perfectly preserved, became a symbol of ancient Egypt's mystical power. Historians still debate the true extent of mummification's decline. Was it a gradual shift away from religious beliefs, or did it also reflect a change in the political and social fabric of Egypt? Some argue that it was the internal collapse of Egyptian society itself that led to the abandonment of mummification, while others believe that external forces, such as the Roman conquest and the rise of Christianity, played a more pivotal role. Regardless of the cause, what's certain is that mummification became a relic of the past, until it was resurrected by the work of archaeologists and adventurers seeking to unlock the secrets of Egypt's ancient civilization. And so, the discovery of mummies in the modern era reignited both curiosity and superstition. The "Curse of the Mummy" stories, popularized by the death of Lord Carnarvon and others connected to the discovery of King Tut's tomb, became a part of the global cultural lexicon. These tales of vengeful spirits and ancient curses added a layer of mystery to the mummies, transforming them into symbols of not just death but also danger and intrigue. The rediscovery of mummification in the 19th and 20th centuries, coupled with these myths, forever cemented the mummy's place in both academic study and popular culture. So, what's the takeaway? Mummification was not just a method of preserving the dead, it was a way of ensuring that the soul's journey continued into eternity. And while the practice itself may have faded away, the fascination with it remains as strong as ever. The mummies of ancient Egypt continue to captivate us, revealing not only the intricacies of their embalming methods but also the belief systems and practices that shaped one of the world's oldest civilizations. And though we may never truly understand all the secrets they hold, the mystery of mummification lives on.